Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 3 and our final day of Capitol Hill Ocean Week 2014. It's been a terrific series of discussions that we've had for the past 2 days, and certainly for the last day. We will have an equally engaging discussion. As we have for previous panels, I want to start with the 30-second PSA from our presenting sponsor, NOAA. To start our first panel this morning, which will look at the future of American fisheries, particularly timely topic with the reauthorization of the major act governing our fisheries before Congress. It gives me a great pleasure and great honor to introduce Congresswoman Herrera Beutler, who serves as the second term as Southwest Washington's member in the House. She serves on the House Committee on Appropriations and the House Committee on Small Business. Her focus is on job creation and economic development, and she is spearheading several bipartisan proposals on these issues. She's also leading efforts for salmon restoration and assistance for groundfish fisheries in the Northwest and the Pacific Coast. And in this effort, she is working on a bicameral piece of legislation with Senator Cantwell, the Revitalizing the Economy of Fisheries in the Pacific Act, which goes by the REFI Act. As my old boss, John Chafee, said, the way Washington works is to find a good acronym and then back a law into it. So I think the REFI Act, with a focus on fisheries, is a perfect model for his theory. And lastly, as many of us heard the other day, Norm Mineta talked about ocean acidification as the most pressing issue facing our ocean, and the Congresswoman is working on legislation on OA as well. So she's at the fore of a lot of the issues that we've discussed over the last 2 days and that we're going to discuss right now. And I'd like to invite her up for some opening remarks.
I'll grab you for help.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Yeah, thank you. I understand you all have had a long and busy week, so I saw a lot of cups of coffee in your hand. That's my kind of conference. Thank you for the opportunity just to introduce this panel and say a few words. You know, with Magnuson-Stevens up for reauthorization, this is really an important time for you all to be here and to be having these discussions with your lawmakers and with policymakers. Southwest Washington, the district that I represented, extends from the Columbia River up to the tip of Willapa Bay. And in Washington State, the commercial and recreational fisheries and that industry support more than 61,000 jobs and contribute more than $34 billion in revenue. So we also have shellfish growers from my district produce about 25% of the nation's oysters. So nationally, U.S. commercial fishermen support 1.3 million jobs, and it is no secret that the health of our waterways, our coastal communities, our oceans is really important to the success of our local economy and the fishermen and the jobs that support our region. So as we all know, seafood is an important part of American consumers' diets. I had some last night, although not with you all. It sounds like that was a pretty good party. I didn't realize this, but we roughly consume about 14.5 pounds per person a year. And I believe it's critical both to our health and our nutrition. And that's one of the reasons I'm working to support a strong fishing industry and strong salmon and fish populations. It's really important to us in the Northwest. Protecting sustainable fishery management practices, including key provisions of Magnuson-Stevens, have been effective on the West Coast and Alaska and is critical both to our economy and to our environment, which are not mutually exclusive. Scientifically informed management is the key to the success, I believe, that we've had in recent years. And now I believe we have to ensure as we move forward that we continue to manage our fisheries with science-based decision making. That means frequent stock assessment surveys, strong cooperation with both fishermen and regulators, which is not always easy, but important, and accountability measures to safeguard the sustainability of our fisheries and our fishery resources. So this is how I believe we protect our resources for generations to come. That's one of the things I love about where I grew up, is we are something of a mecca when it comes to salmon fishing. We have such a unique gem that most people don't even understand. People come to our region. I got to grow up with it. I want to make sure that my kids and my grandkids have those same amazing opportunities. And for my position on the Appropriations Committee, as you mentioned, I am working to make sure that both the fishing communities have the tools they need to maintain healthy stocks and a healthy ocean. So we agree that we need better science to protect our maritime economy and our environment. And I'm happy to be partnering with several folks from the other side of the aisle on this effort. I think it's also really important that a lot of the decisions are made at the local level. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of stocks around the country suffered a lot of significant decline. And this resulted not only in job loss, but in environmental impact. So as we move forward, that is an area where I think that local component is key. And I think what we saw back then was both the commercial and the recreational fishery industries responded and made some tremendous sacrifices. And subsequently, we've seen significant progress to rebuild those stocks. So we still have more room for improvement, but I believe it is a sign that we're on the right track, that 91% of U.S. fishery stocks are no longer listed as depleted. Scientifically based fisheries management is how we continue this trend into the future. You know, as a member of Congress and the only Republican to represent a coastal district from Orange County up to Canada, I believe that it is important that we build partnerships around this work. That's one of the reasons I have been really pleased to get to pick up and work on something that he wasn't my predecessor, but on the Appropriations Committee from Washington State, Norm Dix used to work on PACSURF, Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund. That's something he really championed. And in the recent years, actually, that fund, since he left, has been in jeopardy. And as I've joined the Appropriations Committee, I've gotten to pick up that mantle and help protect the funding in the House. And I'm sure we're gonna see that through on the Senate side. So I'm gonna continue to work on that funding for that crucial program. And before I turn the discussion over to the panel, I do want to take a quick moment to welcome Chris Brown. Welcome. President of Seafood Harvesters of America, who's part of the discussion this morning. And Mr. Brown announced just last week, I believe, the launch of the only national organization representing commercial fishermen. Seafood Harvesters of America is working to reflect the diversity of America's coastal communities, and I really applaud those who strive for accountability in our fisheries, who support strong science-based decisions, and who advocate for the stewardship of our seafood resources for everyone to enjoy. So congratulations and thank you. And with that, thank you for welcoming me, and I'll pass it on.
So I'd like to now invite the panelists to come and take the stage. And with that, I'll introduce Mike Conathan, who's going to moderate this panel. Coming up, guys. Mike is a very well-known presence here at Capitol Hill Ocean Week, and we're happy to have him back once again. Mike currently serves as the Director of Ocean Policy for the Center of American Progress, which was founded by our keynote speaker, John Podesta. And Mike previously served on the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee under Olympia Snowe, and we're delighted to have him back once again to moderate the discussion.
All right. Well, thanks, Jason. And thank you as well to Congresswoman Herrera Butler for providing the opening remarks. It's, as someone who worked on fisheries issues for a Republican, it's always nice to see more folks from both sides of the aisle being involved. And I think we've had some great bipartisan representation at CHOW all week, and that's been really nice to see. And hopefully we'll get to talk about that a little bit later on. As I was sort of watching some of the sponsor logos and things come up, I saw the one come up from Mystic Seaport, and I'm sort of partial to Mystic Seaport. Great to have them as a sponsor this year of CHOW. And I studied there as an undergraduate in a marine affairs program or a maritime studies program that sort of ran the gamut of the interdisciplinary nature. And I think that's one of the things about our fisheries is that it really crosses so many boundaries. It's a huge cultural driver. It's obviously a major food source in this country and around the world, and it's a huge economic driver in our coastal communities as well. So seeing some of that, just seeing the Mystic logo come up, and they're starting their 38th voyage of the Charles W. Morgan, the last historic whale ship, still exists. It kind of just sort of tees up us to think about the history of this industry and how it's evolved, and it's been a constant evolution. Fortunately, we're not actually whaling anymore, but the evolution of the industry to the commercial fishery, to a recreational fishing industry that is a huge economic driver on our coasts, as well as a great source of participation for millions of Americans every year. The ongoing subsistence fisheries in the native communities and other parts of the country and around the world. It's really an issue that touches on so many different levels, and so I'm looking forward to a great discussion today with our panelists, who I should probably introduce since you're all up here now looking at them. To my left and moving down the line, although you guys all shuffled seats now, so I'm going to be a little out of order here with my notes, but I'll do my best. Eileen Sobek, Assistant Administrator of NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service. Chris Brown, as you heard. Chris is the head of the Rhode Island Commercial Fishermen's Association and also the president of the newly formed Seafood Harvesters of America. George Cooper, here representing the American Sport Fishing Association. To his left, we have John Connolly, who is the president of the National Fisheries Institute. And lastly, Barton Seaver, recovering chef, National Geographic explorer, and program director of the, I gotta read this one, Healthy and Sustainable Food Program at Harvard School of Public Health's Center for Health and the Global Environment. So great panel today, really looking forward to a good conversation. And since we're here, and over my shoulder is the Capitol, and Jason kind of teed us up for this one, we are launching into the Magnuson reauthorization season again. It's fully underway. I happened to join the Senate just at the right time of the tail end of the last Magnuson reauthorization process. I was there for about a year, and at the end of the year, we passed the bill. So while I don't take credit for it, I don't see quite how people assumed it was such an arduous process, right? It was 7 years, I guess. But so anyway, as we move into that process again, it sort of raises a lot of questions about where we should be going with the law. And obviously, as you heard from the Congresswoman, we've made a lot of progress under the provisions that were implemented, but there's still some controversial ones as well. And so I guess, Eileen, it might be best to start with you and just kind of get a NOAA perspective on this. NOAA's done a really great job implementing some incredibly difficult mandates from the federal government on this, including annual catch limits for all of our over 500 stocks managed fisheries. Dozens of stocks have been declared rebuilt in the last 5-10 years. And really, our fisheries management structure has become a model for the world. We've seen the European Union implement their common fisheries policy now. So we've got great momentum moving forward, but it would be great to get your perspective on sort of the challenges and opportunities that you see going forward with as we look at the reauthorization process and fishery management here.
Sure, thank you very much. You and the Congresswoman have actually done a great job of sort of summarizing the fact that it's been a long and arduous journey, and U.S. both commercial fishing industry and recreational users really, and the managers who've lived with the last 40 years of regulation under the Magnuson Act and its various iterations deserve a huge amount of credit because we have come a long way. In the 70s when the Magnuson Act was first enacted, and we had potential, we had so many fisheries that were overfished, were at unsustainable levels, where fisheries were crashing, and there were some that were worried about whether we could go on. We moved from a period when foreign fleets were fishing in what was not yet our EEZ, to then having domestic fisheries overfishing. We've come through that, and as you say, we've gone through a very difficult period where once we got teeth in the Magnuson Act at various points and got to the point where we had annual catch limits and accountability measures, where we have rebuilt, we have rebuilt 34 species. We have virtually eliminated overfishing on a regular basis and have accountability measures for when we do have overfished fisheries. We're continuing to get new information about fisheries to not just rest on the laurels of the fact that the vast majority of fisheries are now sustainably managed, that we move to continue to rebuild stocks. There are some stocks that are still problematic where we don't have the information that we need, or they're not responding in the ways that we have expected them to, where we are struggling a bit with trying to find management models, for instance, with red snapper in the Gulf that might work better for recreational fishermen. We know that's still a problem. The New England groundfish fishery is still still a problem. We have a lot of challenges, but I think that we do need to stop and reflect and give ourselves, our industry, our fishermen credit. I think that it was interesting when I started this job, and I wanted to sort of do some gut checking about whether everything my new staff was telling me about how much progress we had been made and how U.S. fisheries are now overwhelmingly managed on a sustainable basis. It's like, is this just, the happy talk in the agency? But everywhere I've gone, that's been the word. We as a nation and as an industry need to take credit for our sustainable programs, which really our industry should get credit with the consumer for our sustainable fisheries practices, for the pain that we've gone through. We should be exporting our management principles to the rest of the world. Do we have room for improvement? Yes. We're going to have to deal with the challenges of climate change. We need to take a more ecological approach to management of fisheries, including looking at all of the ecosystem elements, forage fish, whatever it is, coastal habitats, in our management plans. We need to deal with bycatch. We have made a huge amount of progress on the bycatch issue overall, but we still have challenges. We need to continue to work with our partners in the recreational fishing world to make sure that we are taking their contributions into account and their needs and interests into account. So we got a lot of work. We're really looking forward to it. We think some of that can be done through MSA reauthorization, and some of it we think we already have the flexibility to do. So I will leave it with that.
Great. Yeah, a lot of food to sort of launch into the discussion. As we talk about reauthorization, I mean, there are a couple of bills out there now that are under consideration. The House Committee on Natural Resources passed a version out, sponsored by Representative Doc Hastings, chair of that committee. Bit of a controversial draft in some eyes. It was a largely party line vote out of committee, which is not something we've seen a lot of in the past Magnuson reauthorization processes. On the Senate side, there's a draft bill circulating from Senator Begich and Senator Rubio, the chair and ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmosphere, Fisheries, and Coast Guard. So there is progress in Congress on this reauthorization. It would be great to get thoughts from the rest of the panel on how this process is going, what you see as the key issues in this process, whether they're in the bills or not. What are the things that are missing? What are the things we need? Chris, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I have to stress is that this industry is in recognition of the fact that Magnuson is working. It has worked. We do not need to broadly expand the scope of Magnuson to continue the direction that we've gone in so far. Oftentimes, flexibility is asked for by quarters of the industry or politicians, and in my view, and in the view of my group, flexibility is a poor substitute for greater understanding. Oftentimes, if we haven't gotten to where we need to get to with the stock, it's because we haven't invested enough money in knowing the problem. So flexibility is not the answer. There are stocks that will continue to be problematic in their recovery, even if we do fish at very low levels. Those stocks beg further investigation of another kind. The problems that we face as an industry bringing stocks back that are stubborn or difficult to recover are new. They are not my grandfather's problems. They're problems of this generation. So strict adherence to principles of science is the only thing that will deliver us. this nation has flourished greatly over the course of its existence from its investment in science and reaping the benefits. I don't see that the fishing industry would be any different.
Thanks. George, I mean, there are quite a few challenges as well facing the recreational side of the equation. Different challenges, but.
Yeah, so before just offering a few thoughts on the two bills you're referencing, to give a little perspective on our community and how we're coming into this latest round of Magnuson reauthorization. We put out a report, and I'm not going to go into all the details of the recommendations. Maybe we'll touch on a few of them. We're shorthanding it as the Morris Deal report. It was co-chaired by Johnny Morris, who's the founder and CEO of Bass Pro Shops, and Scott Deal, who's the president and co-founder of Maverick Boats down in Florida, so it has a fishing and boating perspective. But we were very conscious of the fact that it was important for us to come into this reauthorization articulating a vision for what well-managed fisheries look like today. And a major theme of our recommendations is getting to the fact that back in 1976, we were focused on getting foreign fishing fleets out, getting the EEZ set up. Things were exclusively focused on supporting an American commercial fishing industry. Sport fishing out in that space was not non-existent, but certainly not what it is today. Sport fishing out in federal waters has expanded dramatically. I would agree. I think you're already getting consensus here as to what Magnuson has done from a conservation standpoint, ending overfishing. From a conservation standpoint, it got stronger, had more muscles in '96, and then even more in 2006. But we continue to see a focus on commercial fishing. So it is our hope in this reauthorization that we sort of have a moment of synchronicity where we have recognition in the statute and then at NOAA as well of what sport fishing has become in this country. 11 million people saltwater fishing, $70 million economic output associated with that. It's big business. It's not just a nice thing that people do as a hobby. It's an important part of our coastal economy. So with that in mind, and I can touch on a few of our recommendations as we go along, but we look at the House bill and look at our 6 recommendations in here, and we were frankly disappointed as a community. And I work with the American Sport Fishing Association. By extension, there's a pretty cohesive coalition with the Coastal Conservation Association, the International Game Fish Association, Center for Coastal Conservation, and a few other groups. And frankly, a couple of the things that we focused on in this vision report I mentioned, where we really are trying to articulate what we think should be addressed in reauthorization, were touched on, but there's a lot of room for improvement from our standpoint. Given how things are likely to play out with, this is going to stretch certainly into next year, we think there's lots of room for improvement, and we're going to be very engaged on the House side. On the Senate side, we have been thrilled to have the opportunity to work with Chairman Rubio and Ranking Member Rubio and Chairman Begich, and the discussion draft we've reviewed and commented on addresses all of our recommendations, save one. And that is a recommendation that NOAA adopt a recreational fishing policy, but Eileen and her team took care of that at NOAA's recent Sport Fishing Summit by pledging to adopt a sport fishing policy at NOAA, which was a very important step in our view. So we think we're off to a great start in the Senate. We think it's an excellent draft. There's some things that have given us concern, and we're talking to folks in the Hill about that. We think there's a much longer way to go in terms of our goals with the House draft.
Great, thanks. John, from NFI's perspective, how are things shaping up, and what are the challenges that really need to be addressed?
Really to follow on Eileen's comments about making sure that people understand that U.S. fisheries are managed well because they start with a very good law. And the law is generally done in a bipartisan manner, and last time it was done by voice vote. And we think that's an indication that the hard edges of that law get softened out through the discussions over the next couple of months and into next year. Further to Eileen's comment about the U.S. leading the way, Commissioner Damanaki is generally not the most beloved person in the European fishing community. The harvest community doesn't think she's the greatest thing on earth. However, in January, she recognized the success of Magnuson in a comment that the words aren't exact, but she basically said that the U.S. is leading the way because of Magnuson-Stevens Act, and you can teach us so much about proper fishery management. And that's a huge compliment to the folks in the Hill. Mike, you should take all the credit you want from the previous work. But it is the collective effort of the various communities that when Commissioner Damanaki says something like that, people should feel very good, and we should be more forceful, frankly, in communicating the success of that. Specific to the Senate and House bills, we look forward to the revisions coming out or the adjustments coming out after the last rounds of discussion in the Senate bill. The House bill, we're fairly comfortable with. We remain interested in some of the comments about flexibility, and we'll look at that as things move forward.
Great. Well, we'll continue to pick up on these threads. I think I guess Europe really is following in the footsteps of the U.S. if the fishermen are that upset with their minister. So I think that's we don't have a monopoly on that either here. So that's good to know. Bart, in your work, we've talked a lot about sort of the management structure here and the law, obviously, talking about the sort of regulatory structure and there's a lot of top-down, bottom-up conversations that get mixed in here. Your work tends to focus more on the other side of this equation, which is the end user of the fish as opposed to the producer. So from your perspective, I mean, what are the challenges from that angle as we look at these issues?
Well, we've really become so emotionally divorced from the source of our seafood as consumers. And the bottom line is we have fabulous fisheries in America. It's a strategic food reserve if we treat it the right way. We have these campaigns on environmentalism that are really focused on negating our impact on the environment, but we're not really focusing on maximizing the environment's impact on us. I think from the get-go with sustainable seafood, compare this to Farm Aid. These two initiatives started around the same time. Farm Aid said, the farmer is a noble and vital part of our cultural fabric. We must do all that we can to save the farmer. And with sustainable seafood, it was, overfishing is the problem, therefore underfishing must be the solution. And the fisherman was seen was vilified and was sort of put in the context that we must just adjust behaviors on the water. But I think that we have equal responsibility to save not only the oceans, but also to save those who provide us access to the oceans. And really to create a sense of national pride around Magnuson, around the great work that we've done, around people like Chris, who have provided for our table so nobly. And we tend to focus so much on sustainable production that as consumers, we abdicate our responsibility to use these products sustainably. When you look at a cod net, what comes with it? Pollock and haddock and cake and cusk and ling and skate and monk and wolf and dog and ray and robin. I mean, I could go on. Each of these fish could be equally profitable to the human body for the purpose of sustaining ourselves and our health, and yet none of these fish have been profitable to fishermen. And so we have created, as consumers, we have driven an irrational economy that is based on demand rather than one based on supply. For too long, we've simply told the oceans what we are willing to eat rather than asking them what they are willing to supply. And thus, we've forced the hand of fishermen, I think, to follow those economic imperatives, which has led to some of, the vilification of fishermen, but also some of the difficulties that we're now seeing.
Yeah, I think that's great perspective, and trying to figure out how we kind of bridge some of that gap. And sorry, I've been reading a few of the comments from the audience and lost my train a little bit on where I was going to go with that, unfortunately. Oh, I know what it was. Thank you. Thank you, my brain. The government said we've talked a little bit about the law and the policy side, but circling back to Barton's comments here on this, is there a role for federal agencies or perhaps for Congress to play in helping some of that process and sort of helping that realization of there are other fish in the sea, there are other sources of protein, there are other ways to use this resource. I mean, their new guidance came out just earlier this week from the FDA and the EPA revising their guidelines on how much seafood pregnant women and children should consume. And so they went from saying up to, I think it was 12 ounces of fish to 8 to 12 ounces of low mercury fish, which for everybody in this room, that's a pretty easy guideline to follow because we're all pretty clear on what low mercury fish means, I think, for the most part. The smaller fish further down the food chain, without the bioaccumulation, all these big words that the person in the supermarket looking at a can of tuna or a piece of salmon wrapped in cellophane are thinking about. So how's the government doing on that? Is there more of a role for the government there, or does it have to be exclusively driven by the private sector? And I'll just sort of throw that out to whoever wants to answer.
Well, I think from the health perspective, this is really, it is an untapped resource in the battle to create a more sustainable relationship with our ocean, a more economically resilient relationship with our ocean. Because bottom line is, why do we fish? Well, simply to provide food. Why do we eat food? To sustain our bodies. And so the health profession, I think, really should begin to take the lead on this. It is absolutely a public health epidemic that we are not eating enough seafood. And that's not just looking at micro and macronutrient intake. This is looking at larger public health impacts of climate change. It was mentioned that CO2 in the atmosphere is really the greatest threat to our ocean ecosystem. Well, 35% of our our greenhouse gas emissions in this country come from ranching, come from meat production. That is going to be a global public health threat. Increasing our seafood consumption not only is an acute health benefit, but it also avoids larger health detriments in the future. And I think there's also great opportunities to provide access here. When we talk about seafood, this is one of the few foods that we do actually have access to. I mean, I don't know of any other healthful product that's sold in a gas station. Cans of pink salmon, cans of tuna, cans of sardines. You can literally get these at gas stations. And we should be promoting greater consumption of this. I mean, 14 pounds of seafood as opposed to 153 pounds of beef every year. And there's a great disparity there, and I think a real role for public health to begin to shift those consumption patterns.
Yeah, Mike, just on the FDA advice, our research shows that women listen to their nurses primarily in the doctor's office on this question, because the doc only spends about 17 seconds with you. So the real gatekeeper of information is that nurse. Those nurses and those docs, though, listen to their professional societies. And when you talk to the OBGYN professional society, they say, we will follow whatever the government says. So the government, FDA, has an absolute core role in this, in establishing proper policy, because everything flows from that. And research out of the Lancet or National Institute of Public Health indicate that women do more damage to themselves and their developing child by not eating enough seafood when they're pregnant. And I think that's why FDA went to say, eat at least 8 ounces. So that would be a quadrupling of what women now eat. Women now eat 1.89 ounces each week when they're pregnant. And they should be eating 4 times that amount. And that is an absolutely government imperative. Switching now to, we have 4 children. I cared about that when my wife was pregnant. Now I'm a little older. I'm going to switch to more of a cardiac view of this. Sorry, it's a little parochial. According to the government, HHS, a cardiac incident, so a stroke or a heart attack, costs $200,000 per year. $200,000 per incident. Dr. Muzafarian from Harvard Medical School, premier researcher in this area, said that omega-3s from fish, solely from fish, not a pill, not a horse pill, but from fish alone, would prevent 84,000 heart incidents per year. Do the math, 84,000 times 200,000. And if you want a return on your investment on healthcare, eat your fish. If you're Kaiser Permanente, if you're Blue Cross Blue Shield, if you're an insurance company that really is tasked with trying to be preventative in your care, get your people to eat fish. Our organization sponsored something called the Seafood Nutrition Partnership, which begins to broaden this out from just a seafood community issue to more public health community issue, and would really like to engage the insurance community and others in that area. Because when you look at those numbers, that's your return on investment.
Chris, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to really agree with Bart and what he was talking about. Over the course of time, we've come to realize that the American fish-consuming public had turned into fish snobs. We wanted our fish white and boneless, and we wanted it rectangular. Triangular was all right.
Breaded, preferably.
Breaded. And so we would respond to your prompts. We would produce fish that you desired. You have to understand, a long time ago, we transitioned from, although it is a romantic perspective, we are no longer hunters and gatherers, we're businessmen. If you would like to produce a different result from the industry, change your tastes. Empower us with the knowledge that you want other things, and we will respond. There is no more joy or fun or what have you in catching one fish as opposed to the other. We do it for profit. We are businessmen. So when you change your tastes, we change our conduct. The American consuming public is the driving force in how we direct our fisheries. I cannot overstate that.
And I think that the opportunity there really rests with us. I mean, this is a fun exploration of tastes and colors and textures and variety. I mean, this is not only a public health win, as has been discussed, it's an economic win. There was an episode when I was running my restaurant here in DC called Hook. And we were dealing with fishermen, and he was going out reef fishing that day. So I was expecting barracuda, mahi, wahoo, blackfin tuna, whatever. Something to come, and that would be that. And, well, the box never showed up, and we got on the phone and said, hey, I got 700 reservations today. Where's my fish? And he's, well, the box finally shows up, and he said, I feel bad about this, but, it was a bad day of fishing. So, well, I didn't want to leave you in the lurch, so he sent you all the leftover bait. And I opened the box, and I've got about 100 pounds of flying fish. And if you ever filleted a fish, it's a hard thing to do to figure out this hidden, bone structure. Well, throw some wings on the damn thing, and God, it gets even harder. So you know what I did with it? I told everybody in my restaurant the truth. And I sent my servers out there with a story. Oh my God, guess what happened today? Blah, 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 and we were selling the bait and blah. By 7:30, we were sold out because people were buying the story as much as they were buying the fish. And sure, we put it into a great form. It was a delicious dish. But people are willing to do this. They're willing to invest their hard-earned money in the experience and the entertainment that diverse seafood offerings bring us. If we only have the courage to sort of put them out there and put them on the menu.
Yeah, I think it's an important message, and this, and following it through to the sort of next step in this conversation is if we're going to eat more fish, we've got to catch more fish, and we obviously can't just create more fish out of nowhere, because if we could, then the problem between the fishermen and the fishery regulators wouldn't exist, and everybody would be happy. But there are still some things that we can do to improve our ability to produce this protein source, and we can do some aquaculture, and I would like to talk about that. But before we get to that point, are there other things that we can do, or what are the other things that we can do to promote a healthy seafood resource, a healthy fish populations? From the land side perspective. Habitat concerns, ecosystem-based management. How do we see these things playing a role? I mean, it helps. For the recreational industry. I mean, you can't have a recreational industry without fish either. So, what are the protections that we should be prioritizing on that side of the equation?
Well, since you mentioned recreational fishing, one thing I want to do while I have the mic again briefly is just be clear. I'm not sure I was clear enough when I started. That if you want to know what our crowd is focused on, not just in Magnuson reauthorization, but sort of where our collective head is on conservation management of the resource for both sustainability and access, you can find this thing at ASA's website, or the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership actually facilitated this report. I would say, from our standpoint and thinking about a sustainable resource, one of the things we're focused on in this report, and I can't remember who said it, but I think we're in agreement that this is not a reauthorization that needs to be focused on. This is not an overhaul. Whether you want to call it tinkering or fine-tuning, a lot of what I think we're contemplating right now is some practical experience we've had since '06 and some of the things that have happened with the councils in particular trying to implement those things, some adjustments to be made. But there are a couple of things in here we're really challenging people to think bigger. And a real focus for us, and again, to go back to my point when I first spoke about achieving better synchronicity between what sport fishing in America is and how NOAA manages it and how Magnuson deals with sport fishing. To play some catch-up. We sort of think it's our turn in this reauthorization. And one of the things we're trying to get people to focus on is that continuing to use a commercial fishing overlay or management framework on top of sport fishing is clearly not working. No better example than red snapper down in the Gulf right now. And I think you were going to get to data earlier, but the idea that we're going to be able to get the kind of data that we currently have in hand to manage commercial fishing with recreational fishing, it's just not going to happen. And this isn't just a matter of access, allocation, and other things. This is also to go to your point about conservation and better management of the resource. We have countless examples from state agencies and even on the terrestrial side with hunting and fishing management of managing for relative abundance. Managing to MSY for sport fishing does not make sense. We don't go out seeking to sort of maximize biomass extraction. It's a whole different set of criteria and priorities. One of our very highest priorities is to have a sustainable resource. And we understand that when you start managing the relative abundance, you necessarily need to have in some robust buffers. So that's a big theme of ours, and I don't think it gets directly at your point here, but we're very proud as sportsmen's community in general of our role as what we argue is the country's original conservationists. We think that our desire to interact with the resource in that way becomes easier and more achievable when we're managed for what we actually do, what we're actually seeking to do, versus how we've been sort of shoehorned with kind of a commercial fishing framework.
Yeah, Eileen.
Yeah, thanks, George. I was just going to speak to your point a little bit, which is, from the government side of things, of course, sustainability is the key, science is the key to maximize a sustainable level of fishing. Obviously, that means there are going to be some limitations on the popular fisheries, the popular species, and so I think, as Barton said, the question is how to develop a taste or a demand for some of the less traditionally popular, underutilized species. Some of those products we export to other countries where they are more popular. So people elsewhere in the world are interested in those fish, and so we should be helping to support whatever it takes to kind of broaden demand. I guess what was refreshing to this part of the conversation to me is the burden for this can't probably rest with the regulatory stick of the government. We can't legislate or regulate people to like different kinds of fish. So we want to participate. We want to help use whatever interagency, work with our partnerships that we already have for other reasons. And we had a good roundtable when I was up at the Boston Seafood Show this, whenever that was, this spring, trying to work with supermarkets, with restaurants, with the fishing community to how to make other, non-traditional species more, types of fish more attractive, how to make them into rectangles and triangles that seem more user-friendly. Because I think that this is the golden age of the food channel, and I think that there is an opportunity to get the American consumer restaurant going, Whole Foods shopping public to public supermarket shopping public interested in new and different things if it's done right. And I just think it's great that it's not just our job through the Magnuson Act to do that. We've got to help generate that outside of the traditional regulatory context. And the good thing about the progress we've made is we don't have to spend every waking moment trying to, get to a sustainability level. We can now look beyond that and sort of say, how do we address some of these other how do we focus on the health side? How do we bring in HHS and FDA and our partners in the industry to promote some of these other areas?
Yeah, so I know I asked about habitat, and I do kind of want to get back to that maybe at some point. Every time somebody opens their mouth on this stage, I want to follow the thread that they put on the table, so I'm having a really hard time doing that. But I think it's important to stick with this conversation for a minute about kind of the sustainability and perhaps even take it to a conversation about kind of certification. There are obviously some schemes out there. I don't want to say schemes in a negative connotation kind of way. There are organizations that do an excellent job of reviewing and promoting sustainably caught seafood. There's a movement in the Senate bill to perhaps transfer some of that responsibility over to NOAA and the government. And maybe this plays a role in sort of this consumer awareness factor that we're kind of getting at as well. So any comments on that point? Is that a government role? Is that a private sector role? Is there value to that? Yeah. Chris.
I hate to jump out of sequence on you a little bit, but I had an unfinished thought. I'm gonna
Good.
do that. I apologize before I do it to you blatantly.
Appreciate the apology.
In the view of the commercial industry, there is only one ocean. There is only one document that guides your conduct through successful utility of that ocean. That is the Magnuson Act. And it does not matter what your gear type is, if it is rod and reel, or if it is net and trawl door, or seine, or hook. You have a similar obligation to the United States in the pursuit of whatever reward you seek, if it is profit or if it is recreation. So we do not subscribe to the belief that there should be dissimilar standards between the commercial and the recreational fishery. Accountability is what has delivered us to this point, and it will be what continues to deliver us going forward.
Well, all right, now that we're on that thread for a second.
I want to go back to the other thread, though.
All right, I'll come back to John. I want to ask one more question, though, that maybe George and Chris can get at here on this point, because I think red snapper is a good example of this. It's one of the hot-button fisheries right now, obviously. It's a major driving issue in the Gulf. How should we allocate the catch between the recreational and the commercial fisheries in the Gulf?
You want to hit that now?
Yeah, let's just do that.
Well,
and then we'll go back to sustainability, and then we'll go back to habitat, and then I've got like 6 other things.
Yeah, and I could not agree more on the accountability piece, but when the measurement of your effort is being done in a way that frankly is, I mean, MRFs was prehistoric, MRIP is an improvement, but we're chasing, it's a quixotic pursuit of information we're not going to have. And there is now, evidence that is screaming out to us in the Gulf of Mexico with the example of red snapper about how we can measure effort, how we can measure catch, et cetera. We absolutely want to be held to that standard. And again, from a broader sportsman standpoint, whether it's recreational fishing or even hunting, there's a long tradition of management of the resource and accountability that we're proud of, and it's doable. What we're doing now is not working, quite obviously, with the example of red snapper. To go to your specific example of allocation, one of the things I would strongly urge people to look at in this report, one of our top priorities, is having language, and there's some very good language in the current Senate draft about dealing with the fact that councils are not really looking at mixed-use allocations. No better example than red snapper. It was a 51-49% allocation setback in, I think, 1986. A lot's changed since then. It's certainly understandable that the councils don't want to grapple with difficult allocation decisions like that, but we just don't think that we have that luxury any longer. We also think we need to look at the sort of socioeconomic data they're looking at. But the language in here basically would have the National Academies of Science develop criteria, and then to have the councils get into a regular pace of at least looking at allocations. Not compelling the councils to necessarily do new allocations, but to say every 5 years or so, you need to at least look at some of these fisheries that we've identified as worthy of reexamination. Hasn't happened with red snapper in the Gulf, and that's in our view at the heart of why we have such a complete debacle there right now.
Chris?
If I were a hunter and gatherer, I would not be intimidated by the concept of 5-year reallocations. Having negotiated the terms of my financial existence with a lending institution that expects prompt payment every 30 days or so, I have to have a pretty good handle on where my business can go. I have to present a plan. The thought of reallocation hanging over my head like the sword of Damocles is something that this industry cannot tolerate. Years ago, we had the race to fish. Now we have the race to sustainability. Sustainability is a badge of courage and honor that the fishery can wave to the American public and say, look, you gave me a budget to live on, and I aspired to that. I live within it. We're incredibly proud of what we have done. We don't think there is a greater expression of patriotism than to nobly respect the will of the American people and responsibly utilize what we have to fish on. So, the idea of we can't live within ours, we want some of yours, sticks in our craw a little bit, and we're probably not going to go quietly into the night on the issue.
Just one last thing on that. So we have a very similar standpoint from this is a business, this is an industry, this is a way of life for people along the Gulf Coast, and to every year wait and just kind of see, well, how many days are we going to get? This year it's 9 days. And not only is that shorter than we think it should be, it is also every year. We don't know when it's going to be. We don't know how long it's going to be. It is a completely dysfunctional system from our standpoint, not just from a individual recreational angler standpoint, but from a business and economic standpoint.
All right, Chris, 30-second rebuttal. And then
Hey, I'm a recreational fisherman as well. Some of the finest times of my life I spent with my children on the bow of my boat catching fish. And one of the messages I always tried to get across to them was that the issuance of some sort of moral restraint or ethical restraint oftentimes exceeds the value of the trophy that you seek to take home. And I think that is a thought that we should share.
Definitely.
all right, so we solved that one. Good. John, you've been waiting to weigh in. Thank you.
So I think the thread we were pulling on there was certification questions and the government's responsibility. In our view, fisheries management is an inherent government responsibility. In Magnuson, we have created an open, transparent, public participatory process. And anyone that wants to participate can participate. You can participate in plan teams, science and statistics committees, the full council, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to let your arguments win. And if you win, you win. And if you lose, you try to find a better argument or you try to find better data. What is entirely problematic, though, is when groups either do not engage in that or engage in their arguments lose and then try to force retailers into forcing action by the government outside of that process, which exists regularly by some activist groups in their efforts to bypass the process that was set up as a country through Magnuson. And that is entirely problematic. Moving specifically to certification, certification is just a market requirement in some places. Europe requires a certification. Right or wrong, they require it probably because there's a lack of trust in the consuming public in Europe about how their fisheries were managed. And they extrapolated that out to, well, if our fisheries are screwed up, everyone's fisheries must be screwed up. If we have a failed common fishery policy, then certainly the U.S., those colonists certainly couldn't do anything better than we do. So, in fact, they forced a certification program on us. That, though, is also in large measure based on the fact that NOAA does not communicate. NOAA does not communicate the success they have. They don't communicate in a way that my wife understands as the primary shopper when she goes to the store. Don't communicate broadly to buyers how well fisheries are done. And in a way, by not communicating, they have ceded a responsibility or ceded the field, to use a military term, to the other side, to say fisheries are screwed up, NOAA does a terrible job, so we have to have another party come in and question the $1 billion that we spend at NOAA Fisheries, question the 3,500 scientists we have at NOAA Fisheries, question the 1,000 people that participate in the council process. You know, if we need a third party to do that, save the $1 billion.
Eileen, do you want to respond, perhaps?
Sure.
And I'm supportive of an increased budget. I need, but I'm just.
Thank you for that. I think there are a lot of tools in the sustainability toolbox. We, as a country and as a government, have chosen this fabulous tool, the Magnuson Act, as our primary tool to achieve sustainability, and we've been incredibly successful. And I think you are right that we have not heretofore done as good a job as we can making that success known. I think that we were so used to being on the defensive and to being in the rebuilding mode that, and we're so cognizant of the fact that sustainability is you have to be ever vigilant. You're never done. You have to keep going on and keep looking on an annual basis to where we are on particular effort and results. But I think that we now have to come out and be more aggressive in stating and supporting the success of our fisheries, because that is our principal mechanism of saying we have a very pervasive regulatory system, and not just on the fisheries side, on the protected resources side, our fisheries have to comply with the Endangered Species Act, the MMPA, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Our fisheries are sustainable not just in terms of the fisheries stock itself, but on other marine resources. That isn't true in a lot of other parts of the world, and we do need to take credit for that and get it out the door. It is hard, I have to say, to do all the things that we're absolutely required to do, and also the things that it would be good to do and helpful to do, but it is part of our job, and we are going to try to do that. That being said, if there are other tools, we had out until just recently when the comment period closed, we asked one of our public committees to get some ideas out there about whether whether certification schemes of one sort or another, voluntary or government funded, might or might not be good tools. We are going to be open-minded about that. We're going to look at them. I think that we are mindful that we have, again, this underpinning, very strong underpinning of the Magnuson Act as our basic tool. We want to look at targeted risk-based areas or particular fisheries that might need additional, might benefit from additional tools being brought to task, whether we need a universal government-driven from the ocean to the dinner table system, I think remains to be seen.
Yeah. I think, this conversation gets a little bit to one of the points that Barton was making very early on, which is that the farmer in America is romanticized and the fisherman in America is vilified. And particularly now that we're operating in this sustainable structure, we need to change that conversation. But I know you've been waiting to jump in. So.
Well, I think there's a great opportunity here that sustainability, in my research, in my interaction with the field, from college and university food service to corporate health and wellness programs, the whole range of people who are, health insurance, who are looking at this issue, there's not one single cohesive definition of sustainability. So I've come to see that certifications actually are sort of self-defeating in that they certify something that people don't necessarily adapt as their own idea of sustainability, and so they become emotionally divorced from the idea of what they're trying to accomplish. I think that the greatest opportunity that we have is to sell the success of the American regulatory system, and I've begun to see this firsthand. MSC is hard to understand. Sustainability on the water, that's science. The American consumer doesn't get that. And frankly, doesn't have time to really invest in the understanding of this. But you know what they do understand? A little sticker that says "Made in the USA." It's one of the most powerful sales tools that we had ever been invented. Seafood contributes, it's the second largest contributor to our trade deficit in this country. There's a huge opportunity to brand American seafood in all of its, problems and all of its successes, but in all of its job creation, and all of its health that it brings to our communities, and all the heritage, culture preservation that it brings to us. And I've seen firsthand how this is beginning to work, this made in the USA principle. And just the other day, Laurel Bryant, you and I were up in the Gulf of Maine, and I've seen firsthand how she, in her efforts to communicate on behalf of NOAA, literally turned light bulbs on in Chef's head that say, "Oh, okay, now I get it. I'm sustaining fishermen. I'm creating jobs. These fishermen are acting under a regulatory system that they care about, that is really bringing consistent improvement to the management on the water, consistent improvement to the communities that rely on them." And so I think that there's a real opportunity here to really focus, to begin to nationalize what sustainability means to us, and take advantage of the fact that there's more United States underwater than there is above it. And yet our national anthem talks about the fruited plain, but nothing about the rest of the United States.
Oh, we're going to hire someone to change that. That's good. That's really good.
NFI, right here. We're going to rewrite the national anthem. You heard it here first.
We're going to put up a YouTube video. That is fantastic idea.
So this is a great lead into another point that I've been trying to get to on my long list of things. We've already started that. We've got this, as Bart referred to it, the it's the red, yellow, green system of timing. It's which crosses over with the whole sustainability piece, and I've totally bungled that reference.
Not
So
here,
anyway, let's
too.
move on. But point being, we have this massive trade deficit in seafood. 90% of the seafood we consume is imported, although a large percentage of that is actually caught here, exported to be processed, and then re-imported as a product of, in the case of Maine lobster, Canada. In the case of much of Alaska's seafood, China. So obviously, we don't solve the problem by ourselves here. So, Eileen, maybe it would be helpful from your perspective, well, let's put it this way. So John Podesta in his remarks on Tuesday morning talked about addressing the issue of IUU fishing, which is an acronym that, again, nobody except the people in this room understand. We've talked about pirate fishing, we've talked about black market fishing now, as John's term. Whichever one we decide sort of to evolve to, what can we do to help that problem?
Well, it's a very important problem because, as you said, it's one ocean. So what is done off the coast of Africa or off the coast of Europe, South America affects our fishermen. We want to make sure that unsustainable fish is not imported to the United States or is not exported elsewhere and competing against our sustainably caught fish. It's really about, again, it's about leveling the playing field for U.S. Businessmen, but also making sure that the resource that we've really worked so hard to come to sustainable levels where we assert jurisdiction, that's not undermined worldwide by unlimited IUU fishing. So we can, to the extent that IUU product comes into the United States, we can bring enforcement actions, but some of our fishermen who fish on the high seas are part of international regional fishery management organizations so that we have international regulations of high seas fisheries. We need to export our fishery management practices that work, some of the principles that we've come up under the Magnuson Act, we need to export that to the rest of the world. As we've said here, our management regime has worked, and so we should help build capacity elsewhere in the world to do that. There are several treaties that have recently been negotiated and ratified and are waiting for domestic laws to be passed, to be implemented. It's very important for us to sort of follow all of those avenues and the Port State Measures Treaty, the other two treaties, and do everything we can as players on the international field to enforce our domestic laws to get at IUU. It's great. The NGO community is very focused on this. I think the Carry Oceans Conference that's going to follow CHOW next week is going to focus on sustainable fisheries and have a lot of discussions around IUU fishing. So the United States needs to do its part. We're really not going to reap all the benefits of the domestic pain that we've suffered and the domestic success that we're enjoying if we can't get unregulated fishing under control internationally.
John, it might be interesting to hear a little bit about sort of the industry perspective on this point. One of the things that we're talking about in the context of the Our Oceans conference that Secretary Kerry is hosting at Department of State next week is this issue of international overfishing. One of the areas where it seems like there might be some room for improvement is in the area of seafood traceability. Barton, you've talked about this, and Chris Lashevsky talked about it actually on his panel the other day, where he said that he's the CEO of Bumblebee Foods, and the products that they produce, they can scan their barcode on their tuna cans and trace it all the way back to the vessel it came from. That's remarkable. First of all, how cool is technology? But second of all, that's not common practice in the particularly international seafood industry. So. Should we do more on that? What's the industry perspective there?
Sure.
And others feel free to weigh in as well.
Sure. Maybe to step back, we represent harvesters in places like Alaska. We represent a lot of processors, importers, and seafood distributors. So we have a full value chain view of this question. And it's important when we talk about the seafood community in the U.S. or the seafood industry in the U.S. that those more than 1 million jobs, about 455,000 of those jobs are actually dependent on processing or distributing imported seafood. So what we want to be careful about anything that that prevents an ability of a processor in Brownsville, Texas, or Vernon, California, or Gloucester, Massachusetts, Newport News, Virginia. We don't want to damage their ability to actually create those jobs here, because those 455,000 people are pretty happy getting a paycheck, and those are totally reliant on imported jobs. And our view of IUU is, just a quick story. A couple of years ago, there was a fellow out of Alaska that had some product going into Germany, and it was stopped because the steamer that he was using, the tramper that he was using, was on an IUU list. And this guy's been around in the business for 30 years. And he called me and said, my product's been stopped in Germany for something called IUU. What does that stand for? Because in the US, because of the strength of our system, it's a bit of a foreign concept. So the domestic fisheries, we would argue to a great extent, there's not systematic IUU in the US. And the majority of our imports are farmed product, tilapia, pangasius, most of our shrimp, most of our salmon, et cetera, are farmed. So those are by definition not IUU. So you get the products like tuna that potentially have a problem. And that's where groups like ISSF, that Chris and Susan Jackson are leading in concert with groups like WWF, are focused in on that. What we don't want to do is develop a system that solves a problem that, say, that Europe has with fisheries off of West Africa. If there are hotspots of IUU in West Africa, focus in on that and let the Europeans solve that problem, but don't do that on the back of either a domestic fisher, a harvester, or a processor here in the US. Finally, on traceability, companies have a responsibility under the food safety laws in the US to trace their product. So Chris can do this electronically. Others can do it within 48 hours. They can tell you where their fish was caught, where most of they should be able to tell you where all the ingredients were caught. Because if there is a food safety recall, which is the greatest litigation threat that a food company faces or fears, that is what drives their concerns, is a food safety concern. So they have that ability for food safety to drive back, given FSMA in our other laws, the Bioterrorism Act, et cetera. What we fear is having a secondary program of one for food safety and a traceability program all of a sudden required for sustainability. So long-winded answer to say, be very careful about imposing a problem that exists elsewhere on US harvesters. Be careful about doing something that harms jobs in the US that are reliant on imported product, and realize that business people don't want two systems to do the same thing. If you're doing it for food safety, don't make us do it again for sustainability.
Well, isn't there a benefit, though, and you know, we can sort of open this up a little bit, but I mean, there is potentially a benefit to the U.S. harvesters in this, because they are acting within the confines of the law. They are being held to a higher standard, and their market gets undercut if importers who are not being held to those same standards don't receive the same treatment. Chris, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, Jack. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. You know, I think when you take it upon yourself to control the environment, you have to consider the economic environment that you're creating. When you give rise to fisheries overseas, or you continue to support fisheries overseas that operate with fewer principles than ours, you're creating an environment in which the ethical, responsible fisherman in America is compromised. We are hurt by that. My small business has been an innovator in the traceability space for the last 3 or 4 years. Our attempt is to create a value proposition for the consuming public that has a story and certainty that the product that he or she is purchasing was done so in conjunction with a specific management proposal or objective or plan, and in that they can be confident. I think by voluntary administration of sustainability programs within our fisheries, we will continue to educate the buying public to a point where they will look at traceability as a very comforting component of their decision-making process. They will buy American fish that has traceability. They will see imported stuff that does not. Now, this is not to try to stop, successful commerce, but I think if nothing else, we've learned that fishing is capable of change. And I think when we hold foreign fisheries, provide them opportunity through change, that's a healthy way to do it. We're not trying to choke them off. We're not trying to put anybody out of business. Create a market for them that is expecting of something a little better.
Thanks. Yeah. Bart.
Just to complement that or supplement that, the concept of that's a market-based approach that Chris is trying to get something for his boat and his vessels that the market will respond to. That's a very appropriate way to handle that.
Great.
Yeah, I think providing that market incentive to foreign fleets that are operating responsibly, I think is a win as well, and I think actually begins to strengthen the ability of the U.S. processors to continue to hire and to continue to create new jobs. There's a study out of University of Virginia, Dr. Cynthia Jones, who looked at American fish production and against the recommended consumption. And we produce only 60% in this country of all of the seafood that is recommended we eat. And that's if we ate menhaden. That's if we ate,
Not recommended. For all the things that Barton talks about that we should be eating.
Well, omega proteins was on calling it mahimi for a while, and it was canned at Boston Seafood Show. I don't know whatever happened to that effort, but there is an opportunity, I think, through traceability to create that trust and to fulfill a need that we have to create these processing jobs, to give them that value and the trust that they deserve. And also to provide the access to the food that we need.
Yeah.
The other option there is, of course, aquaculture, and gaining a robust policy that really enables job creation, and food security in that front.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're starting to come to it. I have two sort of big topics that I still want to hit on, and we've got about 7 minutes left, I think. And these, by the way, are awesome. I want to commend the audience on the questions that you guys have been sending up, and I'm trying to incorporate elements of them, even if I'm not reading them verbatim off a lot of the cards. They're really great and really helpful to framing the discussion. First on data, because you can't manage fisheries without having solid data, and that is the universal comment that we hear when we talk about fishery management. Of course, you can't get data without a lot of funding, and obviously these guys over here are not really doing the job. I will say it, they are not giving NOAA anywhere near enough money to do the job that they've told them to do under the Magnuson Act, and that's not likely to change anytime soon. Unfortunately. So where else can we get this money from? How can the private sector play a role? How can whether it's recreational or commercial, how can the folks who are making their living doing this support the science that we need to make sure that we can keep managing without putting too undue a burden on the industry? Yeah, Chris.
Well, I don't know that the industry can afford to have the government pay for their science exclusively any longer. With 5 years of flatline funding, the effect on the actual value of the money it probably reduces it by 30 or 40%. As the science can no longer perform as it wants to, it is subject to vigorous peer review and gets picked apart. Uncertainty gives rise to precaution, and we could actually have a scenario where stocks are going up and our access is going down. So in light of that, I've spoke with an awful lot of fishermen around the country who are coming to the realization that we're going to have to fund our own science. A tax at the point of sale on all species is a logical solution to the problem. When I ask them, what sort of problem does unfunded science or poorly funded science represent to your bottom line, they tell me anywhere from 10 to 30%. That's a huge hit. So a 3% hit on a tax up front is a good deal.
Mike, on that, a lot of this is already occurring, actually. In Alaska, the industry pays about $20 million already to fund the observers on the pollock fleet. So $20 million that's good cash. That's good money, but the industry understands that need and pays that. Within our organization, we have two committees that have organized themselves around certain species. A scientific monitoring committee that takes care of some of the pelagics on the East Coast, spends about $800 million in independent research that they then provide to NOAA and the council system. Similarly, the clam industry on the East Coast spends about $300,000 or $400,000 per year on a tax they put on themselves, but that's a voluntary effort But the National Science Foundation found that model credible enough that they actually invited us to participate with them in an initiative in the last 18 months. So we're very happy to do that because it leverages our efforts. We do get concerned, though, Chris, when this becomes a global effort rather than a targeted effort. And this is not to say anything about Eileen's successors many years out, but too often when money is targeted to a specific program in the federal government, it becomes G&A after 15 years. I mean, Salt and Stall Kennedy, general administrative expenses, overhead expenses. Salt and Stall Kennedy was used for a very specific purpose, and it no longer is used for that purpose. It's used to cover overhead at the agency. That's just a budget decision that Congress has made, and voters have allowed them to make that. But when you start saying we're going to have a dedicated fee, whether it's at the state level or elsewhere, those tend to begin to be covering up general administrative expenses. That's just a function of governments.
George, and
So,
then we'll come back.
So on data, and before I get into this a bit more, I just want to be clear and sort of, some of what we were talking about earlier. We're really not trying to frame this as one sector being more important than the other, but we're sort of trying to acknowledge, as we look at the data gathered and the way commercial fishing is gathered, you can obviously count fish, count effort, et cetera, far more easily with commercial fishing versus recreational fishing, where you have people fishing from docks, boats launching from beaches and backyards, et cetera. And a big theme of what we're trying to say here is let's just be realistic about what we can and cannot do. Even in a better budgetary climate, the idea that we're going to have all the data we need to manage the same way, it's just not going to happen. So part of what we're trying to do is acknowledge that. And again, there are countless examples, particularly when you look at the state agencies, when you look at other forms of hunting and fishing, where we don't manage to pounds. We think the Atlantic striped bass example is a very good one. You shift to managing to harvest rates. You go on relative abundance that's more like curves and says these crazy seismographic jags that we see, just to go back to the Gulf example. You can look, we talk with the state agencies a lot, the fact that you've got buy-in on behalf of recreational fishermen when bag limits are changed, season shortened, et cetera, there's more understanding and trust in terms of how that management's working. There's a symbiotic relationship between sport fishermen and the state agencies, for example, we simply don't have with the federal agencies. We think that thinking more creatively, these are not new authorities, but we're pushing for language in this reauthorization that would prompt, whether through national standards or other ways, NIMS to really look itself at some alternative management measures and the councils. For example, doing more cooperative management with the states, whether through the commissions or otherwise. And again, alternative management examples. And I'll just quickly give you an example to keep it on sort of the federal level. When we look at waterfowl management, as done by the federal government down the street at the Department of Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service, you have a very successful system there. You have a system that starts with good baseline, consistent biological information, collected primarily through a biannual aerial survey in Canada and the breeding grounds. And then they don't try to count every single duck, and they don't try to count every single hunting day, but they adjust the seasons for each region in a way that makes sense and that, in this case, waterfowl hunters understand and can buy into. And again, that's relative abundance, it's harvest rates. Now, all of that we recognize calls for appropriate buffers, but we just think it's time to look in the mirror and say, look, this is not working. Yes, MREP's an improvement, but even if, we get more money in MREP or suddenly things change from a budget standpoint up there, we're not going to get there. It's a completely quixotic pursuit. And so that's a big challenge we're trying to put forth in this report and try to at least take steps in that direction in this Magnuson reauthorization.
Great. Eileen, earlier you had brought up the complicating factor of climate change, and that is a huge thing that has to overarch everything we're doing in fishery management, particularly data collection. Is that part of the consideration, and how are we factoring that in? And your thoughts on the challenges here?
Sure. I mean, that is the huge new challenge, and everybody, you've articulated sort of what our limitations are. We are desperately trying within the agency to become more efficient and more innovative and more flexible about how to use our science resources better. We're really trying to promote the conversation between the science side of the house and the regulatory side of the house, the management side of the house. We are a science-based service agency, so we we are driven by, our management has to be driven by science, but we need to have our managers talking to our scientists about what kind of information they need. We're moving beyond the single stock assessment kind of cruise. We're using cooperative research. We're trying to use new tools like electronic monitoring to figure out, those aren't panaceas. There's not push a button on your cell phone and our fishery management science challenges are over, but there are going to be new tools. So we're trying to figure out what science do we really need? How do we I don't know what the word is for science, multitasking. How do we look at multiple species? How do we factor in climate change? How do we do that on a fair and regular basis? We can't do assessments of every fishery every year. How do we have kind of a fair and kind of rotation? And how do we do that with some great new fabulous laboratory facilities and brand new, just recently commissioned vessels? And how do we do that with other parts of the fleet that are aging and other laboratory facilities that are really, really dated?
I just wanted to flag something real quick that I meant to mention, and that's in the Senate draft, there is language contemplating non-traditional data. We think makes a lot of sense, particularly from a rec fishing standpoint. You've got some innovative programs I think Eileen was alluding to with some self-reporting using, iPhones, cell phones, et cetera, and other sort of creative ways to put useful data into the system. Frankly, we've seen other agencies embrace that. It has been very difficult to get people thinking that way at NOAA. And again, we see some language where we maybe give a nudge in that direction.
Okay. Yeah, and the technology piece I think has got to be huge in this. There are actually this weekend at 4 or 5 sites around the country at the aquarium, sort of in conjunction with, again, the Carry Our Ocean conference, these fish hackathons where they're bringing in, I guess this is the thing that people do in the computer world that is totally foreign to me, but they bring in the hackers to come into the related aquarium facilities. I don't know if they're actually in the aquariums to work for 48 hours and develop new technological solutions to, in this case, specifically fishery management data collection initiatives. So, I think hopefully, technology will save us all from everything, as I'm sure we're aware, and hopefully that'll apply to fisheries management too. So I am.
You got red listed.
I got totally red listed so fast, and we haven't done aquaculture, and we haven't done. There's the habitat. We never got back to habitat. I tried on habitat.
Habitat's important, and aquaculture is the future. Okay?
Exactly. There you go. Done. I do have one last 2-second question, which is for Barton, who is actually. While he's a recovering chef, he's going to relapse next week for the Ocean Conference. And so, what are you going to serve?
Before I answer that, I would also I'd just like to point out and congratulate Chris on quoting Dylan Thomas in a fisheries panel. Do not go gently into this dear night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. What a statement for a fisherman. But I have the wonderful opportunity to highlight and accentuate the great work that's happening in my home state of Maine and in the Gulf of Maine there. You'll be serving lobster, one of the great success stories, but also Acadian redfish as the entree. Really highlighting the fact that fisheries management can bring about the restoration of stocks, profitability, pride, prudence of fisheries, and we really need to do all that we can to congratulate those who have worked so hard to make that happen.
All right. Well, thank you very much to the panel. Thank you for a great discussion. Audience questions were spectacular.
So I want to thank the panelists and especially Mike for leading what really I think is the fastest 90 minutes in the history of discussion on the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act. It was a riveting discussion. I will say the online audience, the Twitter feeds lit up not only with quotes from Chris, but quotes from Barton and everybody else on the panel. You guys offered sound bites for the audience in a way that we haven't seen before, and certainly you guys could have kept going for the full 3 days of CHOW, more than just the 90 minutes that we had. It was a great discussion. A round of applause again for the panelists.